Hi everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. This is Mohammed Kubaib. In this video, we are going to discuss about Microsoft Azure DNS service and how it is important when it comes to Azure Virtual Desktop and Citrix Desktop as a Service. If you find this video useful, please subscribe and hit the bell icon for future videos. Azure DNS, it is a hosting service for DNS domain that provides name resolution by using Microsoft Azure infrastructure. So basically it is a service which will help you to do the name resolution for your resource in Azure. By default you will have two types of DNS service in Azure. One is default DNS, which is by default Microsoft is going to provide for your resource, and it is having a domain called internal.cloudapp.net. It means whenever you create any VMs and when you do the name resolution, it will use internal.cloudapp.net along with your VM name to do the name resolution. It means if your VM name is VM1, so when you do the DNS lookup, so the result will come with vm1.internal.cloudapp.net. so this is the default DNS comes along with Microsoft. Then we have a custom DNS, your own DNS server. For example, if you want to use your own DNS server instead of the default Microsoft one, for example you have your DNS server in on-premise, or you have built your DNS server in Azure itself, then you can use that DNS server on your VNet, so that all the name resolution will happen using your own DNS server instead of the default one. Let's go back to our whiteboard and we will see in detail. In an Azure environment, let's say you have a VNet and you have a subnet, let's say subnet 1 and subnet 2, and under this subnet you have created a VM which is VM1, and here it is VM2, and the IP address of this is 10.196.1.7, and the IP address of this is 10.196.2.5. so in a environment where you do not have any DNS configured, so by default when you do a name resolution from this VM to the other VM, for example you are doing a VM from VM1, you are trying to do a name resolution for your VM2, then if there is no DNS in the environment, then this name resolution will fail. Okay, so it won't give you any IP address as a result of your name resolution. Okay, so to overcome this, Microsoft will give you a default DNS which is called internal.cloudapp.net. okay, so whenever you do a name resolution for this VM or this VM, so the result will be vm1.internal.cloudapp.net, and it will give you the IP address as a result of your name resolution, which is 10.196.1.7. so this is about default DNS service which is provided by Microsoft. So you no need to define anything. Whenever you create any VNet and when you deploy any VMs and when you do the name resolution, so by default Microsoft will assign this domain name for you to use to do the name resolution. This is about default DNS. Now let's talk about custom DNS. So now you have your VNet here, and you have your subnet 1 and subnet 2, and you have your VM. This is VM1 IP address is 10.196.1.7 and the IP address of this one is 10.196.2.5. The name is VM2. So earlier we have seen when you do the resolution it will give you internal.cloudapp.net, but you don't want to use the default one. Okay, you want to use your own DNS server. For example, you have a dedicated DNS server which you deployed, either it is in the on-premise or it is in your Azure cloud itself. Let's say this is the Azure cloud, so you want to use this DNS server. Let's say the DNS server name is, the domain name is VDI bus.site. So you want to use this DNS for your name resolution. Then we need to use something called custom domain configuration. So in your VNet you need to mention the DNS IP address of your DNS server. Okay, the moment you mention the IP address of your DNS server in this VNet, all your name resolution, it will use this DNS server to do the name resolution. So once you configure your default, once you configure your custom DNS, then whenever you do any name resolution, it will do the name resolution with vm1.vdibus.net bus.site. So it will do the name resolution with the one which you have configured. So it will give you the IP address accordingly, that is 10.196.1.7. So this is how custom DNS works. So in a normal production environment we will use custom DNS to do the name resolution of our Azure virtual desktop or any other infrastructure as a service resources. See the demo of Azure default DNS service. So I have a VM, that is DC and test VM. So let's log into one of the VM. So I'm going to log into test VM. Both are located in central US. So from this VM I will try to do the name resolution for my DC, and we will see the default response and the name resolution. So I will do RDP to this VM. Now I am inside my VM, so let's open the command prompt. I'll make sure my host name before I run DNS lookup. So I'm in test VM. So now I'm going to do a name resolution for my other VM, which is DC. So I'm going to enter dc.internal.cloudapp.net. So if I do name resolution, so you can see it will resolve the IP address of my DC virtual machine. So since we don't have any DNS service configured, by default Microsoft will provide the default DNS service, which is internal.cloudapp.net. So even if you ping to dc.internal.cloudapp.net, so you will get a response with the IP address of your DC. So this name resolution from the DC to IP address, it is provided by the default Microsoft DNS service. So by default in your Azure environment, if you do not have any DNS configured on your VNet, so it will use the default DNS service provided by the Microsoft, which is the domain name is internal.cloudapp.net. Now let's see the demo for custom DNS. So custom DNS is nothing but you have a DNS server which you built in the Azure. It is a separate virtual machine. On top of it you have installed Windows Server and DNS role and domain controller role. Or in the on-prem you have a DNS server and you are going to use the same on-prem DNS server in your Azure. The connectivity will be through site-to-site VPN. So but in this demo I have a VM which is created in Azure. The name of the VM is DC. So in DC I have installed domain controller role, that is Active Directory, domain service and DNS. So if I go to the VM, this is my VM, DC VM. So I am inside my domain controller, that is DC VM. If I go to add roles and features, so you can see the DNS and ADD, that is Active Directory domain service role, already installed on this server. So here you can see ADDS, and then we have DNS also. So we are going to use this DNS server in our virtual network to do the name resolution. So DNS is very important. Without DNS you cannot do name resolution, so eventually you cannot take any VMs in domain as well. So let's go to my DNS management. So here we can see our domain name is vdabus.site. So any VM which should use this domain name for the name resolution. So if it is a machine name is VM1, so the name resolution should be vm1.vdabus.site. So this is the domain name which we are going to use. So earlier by default Microsoft will use internal.cloudapp.net. So when we configure custom DNS, so it will use vdabus.site. So before we configure the custom DNS, we will see what is the behavior of the name resolution. So I am going to log into one more VM in the same virtual network. So now I logged into the other VM, which is test VM. If you go to ipconfig/all, under DNS server you won't see your DNS server. This is the Microsoft default DNS server 168.63. so you do not see any DNS server belongs to your infra, so because we did not configure it. So even if you try to take this VM in domain, eventually it will fail, so because it won't be able to do the name resolution for your domain, so domain joining is not possible. Let's go to my computer and try to join it to the domain. So it will fail because it cannot be contact the domain controller, that is vdabus.site. It cannot be contacted because DNS is not configured yet. So let's go to our portal and we'll configure custom DNS. To do the custom DNS configuration, first we need to go to the virtual network. So here I am in the virtual network blade, so I need to click on my virtual network. So this is my virtual network on which I have all my virtual machines, so I need to click that. Then I need to go to DNS server. So as you can see, by default it is using Azure provided DNS server, so we need to click on custom DNS. Then we need to enter our DNS server IP address. This is the IP address of my DNS server. So once you enter the IP address of a DNS server, then you can click on save. If you have multiple DNS server, you can enter the additional DNS server details as well. Then you can click on save. So now your virtual network is configured with your own DNS server, so that you can use that DNS server to do the name resolution. So let's go back to our VM and we'll see the result for our name resolution. So now I'm inside my test virtual machine. So let's go to the command prompt and first we will see the DNS server. So yeah, I will go to ipconfig/all. Now you can see under DNS server our own DNS server is listed, that is 10.125.1.4. so if you do the NS lookup now, it should resolve to the actual IP address. So I'm going to do NS lookup for dc.vdabus.site. So now it is doing the name resolution for my IP address of my dc.vdabus.site. So now it is using its own DNS server, that is a custom DNS server for the name resolution. So let's go to our computer management and we will see the domain join process. So technically it should work now because now we have the DNS configured and it is able to reach my domain controller through the name resolution. So let's go to the domain, and I will enter my domain name, and I will enter the credential here. So as you can see, now it is prompted for credential to join the domain. So I'll enter the credential and I'll click OK. So as you can see, my VM is now joined to the domain. Okay, so this is only possible if you configure custom DNS. So this is very important with respect to your Azure Virtual Desktop. So when you are deploying or designing Azure Virtual Desktop, so make sure that on your VNet custom DNS is configured with your own DNS server. We have seen what is default and custom DNS. Now we will discuss about private DNS zone. Private DNS zone, it provides a reliable and secure DNS service for your virtual network. Azure Private DNS manages and resolves domain name in the virtual network without the need to configure a custom DNS solution. For example, if you don't have any DNS server in your virtual network, as I mentioned, by default it will use the default DNS, which is internal.cloudapp.net. okay, so if you have a requirement to use your own DNS server instead of the default one, you should go to custom DNS. So custom DNS, again you have to create a separate DNS server and you have to do the maintenance, etc, etc. So all the maintenance and everything, it's under your responsibility. So to overcome that, Microsoft will give you a service which is called private DNS zone. So in Azure you can create your own DNS zone based on your naming choice, and you can use that DNS zone to do the resolution. So let's go to our whiteboard and see how it looks. So let's say you have a VNet, and under VNet you have VMs, that is VM1, and then we have VM2, and by default when you don't define any DNS, Microsoft will use its own default DNS, which is internal.cloudapp.net. okay, so whenever you do any resolution, it will use that, as we seen in the previous chapter. So now you don't want to use the default DNS, okay, so you want to use your own DNS name, that is vdibus.site, to do the name resolution. okay, now to do that, either you should use custom DNS as we mentioned earlier. So if you use custom DNS, for example you are using a DNS server, own DNS server, so if you use custom DNS, then you have to manage this DNS server, and you need to do all the maintenance things, and you need to maintain all the DNS records, everything. So it is completely your responsibility. If this server goes down, then none of your VMs can able to do the name resolution. okay, so and you don't want to maintain such environment. okay, so to overcome this, instead of using custom DNS, Microsoft have a service which is called private DNS zone. Private DNS zone. okay, so this service, it will help you to create a DNS zone with your name. okay, if it is a vdibus.site or .local, or based on your naming convention, you can use any domain. So this is purely private. So the once you create this DNS private zone, then you will link this VNet to this DNS zone, the one you created. For example, if you have a multiple VNet, for example VNet 2, here also you have a VM, and you do the name resolution between these two, then also you need to bind this VNet to this domain private zone. okay, once you bind this to the private zone, all your VMs, right, it will use this zone to do the name resolution. okay, so in this scenario you no need to manage any external DNS or on-premise DNS. You can use your own DNS in Azure, and this DNS is highly available. So all the name records, a records, txt record, everything you can create in this private DNS zone, and you can use this DNS zone to do the name resolution of your VMs in the VNet or across the VNet as well. So this is about private DNS zone. Let's see how to configure private DNS zone. So using private DNS zone, you can use your own DNS name to do the resolution without building any DNS server in the virtual machine. So before going to do that, I'll go to my virtual network. I will select my VDA VNet, and under DNS, so I will change back to default DNS and I will click save. So once I do, if any name resolution I am doing, it will use the default one, which is internal.cloudapp.net. So now I am going to create a private DNS zone. The zone name is vdabus.com. So once we configure that, any name resolution, it will use vdabus.site instead of the default internal.cloudapp.net. So let's go to the portal and type DNS private DNS zone. So let's click on private DNS zone, select create private DNS zone. I'm going to select my resource group, then the name, this is the domain name which you want to use. In my case, I'm going to use vdabus.site. So if you plan to give any other name, you can give as per your requirement. You can give it like vdabus.local, vdabus.com, or whatever the name, so that you can use it for your name resolution. I will review and create. The validation is passed, so now I'm going to click on create. So it will create a private DNS zone with the name vdabus.site. So now private DNS zone is ready. Let's go to the resource. So alternatively, you can search in the search bar and you can select private DNS zone. It will take you to the same place. So you need to select your domain, that is private DNS domain. So here under overview, you can see the records. Okay, so these are the DNS record, the default record. So we need to create a record here. For example, I'm going to create a DNS record, that is DC, and the IP address of this one is 10.125.1.4. I'm going to select OK. The record is created in my private DNS zone. Okay, so the record is DC A record, the IP address is 10.125.1.4. So now if I try to do any name resolution from any other VM in the network, I should be able to get the name resolution with this IP address for DC. So as you can see, we have a virtual network, right? So we need to bind this site, this private DNS domain, to the virtual network. So here you can see under virtual network, we have this VDA network. Okay, so under VDA VNet, we have all your VMs. So to do the name resolution using private DNS zone, we need to attach this VNet to the DNS. So if you wanted to do the name resolution in another VNet, for example, you have another VNet in another region, then also you need to bind the virtual network to the DNS zone. So in this example, we are going to bind this VNet so that all the VMs in this VNet should be able to do the name resolution using our DNS zone. So let's go to the DNS zone, private DNS zone. Under virtual network links, we need to click on add, then give the name. I'm going to give it as a name DNS linking. then I will select my VNet. So this is my VNet. So then you click OK. So the moment you attach your VNet or you link your VNet to your VDI bus.site private DNS zone, then any VMs inside this virtual network can be able to use this DNS private zone, and it can be able to do the name resolution. So let's go to our test VM. So now I am in my test VM. I'll go to command prompt. I'll make sure the host name. So as you can see, this is my test VM. I am going to do a name resolution now to dc.vdbus.site. So now it will use our private DNS zone to do the name resolution. So let's go to NSLookup. So let's first check the DNS server configured. So I'll say ipconfig/all. So as you can see, DNS server now it is the Azure provided DNS server. Okay, it is not your custom DNS server because we removed our custom DNS. So let's go to NSLookup. Then we will try to do a NSLookup for dc.vdi bus.site. So now as you see, you can do the resolution. It is replying with the IP address. So now it used Azure private DNS zone to do the name resolution. So using this, you can do the name resolution for your Azure resources without deploying any additional virtual machine to host your DNS servers. So but make sure that while you are using Azure Virtual Desktop, this configuration is not supported because you cannot take domain, you cannot join machine in domain using private DNS zone. You must use custom DNS to do that. So if you are planning for Azure Virtual Desktop, so make sure that you have the custom domain. When it comes to Azure Virtual Desktop, the private DNS zone will be helpful while configuring private endpoints for your storage accounts or Key Vault. So while using storage account or Key Vault, if you wanted to create private endpoints, then you have to create a DNS records. So you can use private DNS zone to create the DNS records for your storage accounts or Key Vault. We have covered private DNS zone. Now let's talk about public DNS zone. So public DNS zone, it is a service from Azure to resolve host name in your public domain. So you can use public DNS zone to host your public DNS records. So let's go to our whiteboard and we will see in detail. For example, let's consider your on-prem environment. Here you have your Exchange server. Then here you will have your user. Okay, the IP of the Exchange server is 10.125.1.8 and the name it will be mail.vdi bus.site. So if you want to access your Exchange server, you will type mail.vdi bus.site. So your DNS server will resolve that to 110.125.1.8. Then you can able to access your email service. Okay. So let's say if you wanted to access the same email service from the internet, you will type mail.vdi bus.site. Okay. So the result of this, you won't get your email website. Why? Because your email is not available for the internet. Okay, it means it is not available on the public DNS. To access your email from your internet, first you should have a public IP address. For example, you have a public IP address, for example 110.125.8.5.8. Okay, once you have your public IP address, then you should have public DNS entry. Okay, for this you should have a public DNS entry. So to do the public DNS entry, you should use your service provider DNS portal. Either you can go to GoDaddy or Hostinger or your service provider, for example Airtel or Jio, Tata Communications if it is in India, then you can go to them and you can tell that I need to do a DNS record entry in your public DNS to do the name resolution. So what they will do, they will do a DNS entry, DNS A record, which is mail.vdibus.site, and the IP address will be this public IP address. Okay, so the moment this entry is created, when you type on your laptop from the internet mail.vdibus.site, it will hit this and it will get the IP address, your public IP address. From the public IP address, through netting, it will reach your Exchange server. Okay, now you are able to access the Exchange server. Here the thing is, you are hosting your DNS record in the DNS provider, either it is GoDaddy as I mentioned, or Hostinger, and there are n number of services available in the internet to host your public DNS record. Okay, so if, let's say, if this goes down, then you won't be able to access your email from the internet. Okay, so in Azure you have a service called public DNS zone. As I mentioned, public DNS zone, what this will do, since Azure is a highly available solution compared to your service provider, maybe you can use Azure to host your name resolution records. Okay, so you can use this record here in Azure. You can, in Azure you can create a public DNS zone, which is vdibus.site. Under this public zone you can host your name records, that is mail.vdibus.site, which is pointing to the public IP address, that is 125. Whatever the IP address. Okay, so the moment you create this in Azure, so whenever you, from the internet, if you try to access your email server, first, in the earlier case it used to go to your service provider, from there it will get the name resolution, and then it will reach to the public IP address and it will go to your data center. Right now what it will do, instead of going there, it will go to your Azure. From Azure it will look into the public DNS zone. From public DNS zone it will take the public IP address and then it will go to your Exchange server. So this is the service offered by Microsoft, where you can use a Microsoft Azure service to host your public DNS records instead of using the third-party service provider, because Microsoft is a highly available solution and it is having 99.99% of SLA. So you will have highly available and very minimal downtime related to DNS name resolution when you go with Microsoft Public DNS Zone service. Let's see how to use public DNS zone to do the name resolution for our publicly facing services. So in my example, I have a virtual machine which is DC, and the public IP address of this machine is 23.99.193.164. So if I do ping to dc.vdibus.site from my machine, that is my client machine, which is connected to internet directly, so I won't be able to do any name resolution. Why? Because there is no address record created in my public DNS to do the resolution. So normally we will create DNS record for our public objects in our service provider DNS zone. So in my case it is hostinger.site, so that is the service I am using for my public DNS record. Let's go to Hostinger site. So as you can see, I am in the DNS provider site. So this is my domain vdibus.site, which I purchased from Hostinger. So I have a DNS server. These are the DNS servers the Hostinger are using to do any name resolution. So if I wanted to do name resolution for my dc.vdibus.site, I need to go to this place. I need to enter my A record. This is the name, that is dc.vdabuzz.site. Okay, and points to the IP address. The IP address of my vdabuzz.site is this IP address. This is the public IP address. So I have to copy this and I need to enter it here. So once I click on add record, right, so after 15 minutes it will take some time to reflect. After 15 minutes, if I try to do name resolution, it will resolve my name and I can connect to my VM directly through the name instead of IP address, because I have the name resolution now. So in this example, we are using Azure DNS, Azure Public DNS, to host our records instead of this portal, instead of service provider portal. So let's go to our Azure portal first. Then we need to type public DNS. Click on DNS zones. Then click on create DNS. Enter the resource group details here, then give the domain name. So I am going to give vdabuzz.site. This is my public DNS domain, so the region will be global. Then click review and create. So it will validate the settings and then it will create the public DNS zone. So I'm going to create now. So it will take some time to create, so let's wait for this. So it's created the public DNS zone. So let's go to the resource. So here you can see I am under my public DNS zone. So by default you can see the records. There are two records, default records. So we need to create a record here. So let's create a record. The name will be DC, so it will be dc.vdabuzz.site. The IP address is my public IP address. So if I go to my virtual machine, this is my virtual machine. So this is the public IP address of the virtual machine. So I will copy the public IP address and then I will enter the public IP address here. So now we have created the public DNS entry for my virtual machine. So technically I should able to do a ping and I should get a response of my public IP address for this name resolution. Ping, if I do a ping or NS lookup to DC, I should get public IP address which we just created over here. So before we do any other configuration or testing, we need to do one more change. So as you can see, we have name servers here, 1 2 3 4. So these are the Azure name servers which will provide you the name resolution for DC. Okay, so in our service provider portal you can see these name servers, right? So we need to replace these name servers with Azure DNS servers, so that any request going to dc.vdabuzz.site or any request is going to vdabuzz.site, it will be forwarded to Azure. So let's change the DNS name server here. Click on change DNS name server, then copy the name server from Azure. So copy this and paste it over here. So I have copied all the name servers from the Azure portal. So now any request going to vdabuzz.site will be routed to my Azure DNS server. So once it is reaches Azure DNS servers, right, so it will read the record from here and it will respond back with the corresponding IP address. So let's save this configuration. So now name server is changed and all the requests related to vdabuzz.site will land in Azure. So Azure will respond with this IP address. So we need to wait for another 10 to 15 minutes for the reflection. So after that, if we do the ping or NS lookup for dc.vdabuzz.site, we should be able to get this IP address. So let's wait for 15 minutes. Let's open the command prompt from my local machine. and try to do ns lookup for our dc.vdibus.site. So as you can see, we are getting the IP address and it is doing the name resolution. Now the name resolution is performed by my Azure DNS zone, that is public DNS zone, instead of service provider DNS. So this is how you can use Azure service to host your external or public DNS records, so that you can have a highly available DNS solution for your critical workloads. So in this video we have covered default and custom DNS along with private and public DNS zone. Thank you for watching the video.